Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that I know a lot of you have been interested in, toxic workplaces. And to really get into it, we're diving deep into Pete Havel's book, The Arsonist in the
It's
Office.
a book packed with insights, drawn from Havel's own pretty intense experiences, but also from interviews he did with various business leaders and just his observations of how things really work or don't work in different workplaces.
And what we want to do in this deep dive is extract like the absolute key takeaways for you. So you walk away with a clear understanding of, what actually defines a toxic workplace, the kinds of behaviors you should be watching out for, the very real costs of these environments, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it, whether it's navigating a tricky situation you might already be in, or even better, avoiding those toxic traps altogether in the future.
And what I think makes Havel's book such a good starting point for this is that he doesn't sugarcoat anything. Right from the get-go, you're plunged into his experience of starting a new job at this place he calls the firm. And it's like, whoa, immediate red flags.
Yeah, I mean, he describes arriving on his first day, all excited, high hopes, ready to make a difference, and he's immediately hit with these cryptic warnings from colleagues about quote unquote special challenges.
And then there's Ted, right?
Bad.
His new colleague who's practically sprinting out the door after just a few rushed words with Havel. It's like, what is going on here? Clearly something is seriously wrong.
Okay, so let's get to that fundamental question. What exactly makes a workplace toxic? Havel, he keeps things pretty straightforward. He says it's basically the absence of those good, basic societal norms that we all expect, those rules of respectful human interaction that should be in place everywhere. And in their place, you get all these poisonous elements seeping in.
And a really important point he makes is that this isn't some random occurrence, right? It's not just bad luck. Toxic workplaces often stem directly from the people at the top. It's either the leaders themselves behaving badly, or even worse, I think, is when they just completely fail to address the bad behavior of others. Like, they're letting it slide, and that's what really allows that toxicity to take root.
It's almost like a neglected garden, right? If you don't deal with the weeds early on, they just completely take over.
Exactly. And then we've got Dr. Bennett Tepper, who adds another really important dimension to this definition. He emphasizes that it's the sustained display of hostile behavior. And we're talking verbal, nonverbal, but importantly, excluding physical contact. It's that chronic, ongoing nature of the negativity that's so crucial.
Right, so it's not just, a one-off stressful day or a heated debate. It's the constant drip, drip, drip of disrespect and hostility. That's really the hallmark.
Exactly. And to illustrate this even further, Havel lays out his toxic top 20. Think of it as like a warning sign checklist.
Yeah, and some of these are just so spot on. Like number one, a pervasive fear of reprisal. People are terrified to speak up, share their ideas, or raise concerns.
Which is a disaster for any organization, right?
Yeah.
Not only do you miss out on valuable insights and perspectives, but it creates this culture of conformity and silence where problems can just fester because no one dares to point them out.
And then there's the whole ignoring, explaining away, or even defending bad behavior. It's like the bar for what's acceptable just keeps getting lower and lower.
And that sends such a damaging message. It basically tells everyone that there are no consequences for acting poorly.
Yeah.
So those toxic individuals, they feel emboldened and the cycle just continues.
Then you've got this really disturbing image of the Walking Dead employees. These are the people who've, somehow fallen out of favor, and they're basically treated as invisible.
Yeah, their contributions are ignored, their potential is completely wasted, and they're just existing, but not truly thriving in the workplace.
Yeah.
Which, of course, affects everyone's morale.
Havel also talks about high levels of gossip, but with a fascinating twist. In the most severely toxic workplaces, he argues that the gossip might actually be more accurate than the official line.
It's a pretty damning indictment of how those organizations communicate, right? When you reach a point where no one trusts the formal channels, people will inevitably turn to the grapevine, even if that information is, less than reliable.
Another big red flag is when management actively pits employees against each other.
Oh, classic divide and conquer tactic. It's all about creating chaos and preventing people from forming any kind of, united front. And the result, constant suspicion, backstabbing, and zero teamwork.
And then you've got the idea of secrecy being like a superpower, where people hoard information because knowledge is power.
Which is incredibly detrimental to the organization as a whole, right? Because when information isn't shared openly and freely, it just hinders problem solving, it slows down progress, and it ultimately prevents everyone from achieving their goals.
And of course, we can't ignore the human cost of all of this. Havel talks about the physical manifestations of stress, things like, sleeplessness, ulcers, high blood pressure.
Yeah, those are not just minor inconveniences. They're very real symptoms of a toxic environment taking a toll on people's health and well-being.
It's important to clarify, Havel does point out that just because you encounter, the occasional bad behavior, that doesn't automatically mean you're in a completely toxic workplace.
Right. It's about the frequency and the pervasiveness of those negative patterns. He actually uses his own experience at the firm as like the ultimate example, calling it a Chernobyl-level toxic environment, which, I mean, paints a pretty vivid picture.
Now, speaking of vivid pictures, this brings us to that central metaphor of the book, the arsonist in the office. It's how Cecil, Havel's boss, introduces him to Hazel.
Yeah, and it's quite the introduction. Cecil compares Hazel to those volunteer firefighters who, for whatever twisted reason, actually set fires. Maybe they like the thrill, maybe they want more resources, maybe they just enjoy watching things burn. It's a really powerful analogy.
And what makes it even more unsettling is Susie's reaction to Hazel. She flat out says, she terrifies me, and then she goes on to explain how she's been a target of Hazel's behavior in the past.
And then there's the fact that, if you recall, Cecil mentions that Hazel herself has filed like 30 complaints against other people.
Oh, yeah, 30.
Correct.
Which just makes you wonder, what is management doing? Why is she still there?
It really suggests that there are some deeper issues at play within the firm's leadership. They're either unwilling or unable to actually address this problem head on.
Okay, so now let's dig into why this all matters so much. Why should organizations really care about tackling toxic workplaces? Havel makes a very compelling case, both through his own stories and by bringing in a lot of outside research, that these environments are incredibly costly. And we're not just talking about, a dip in morale, although that's important too. We're talking serious financial damage.
Absolutely. And a perfect example of this is the Bruno Iskel London whale situation at JP Morgan Chase. We're talking billions of dollars in losses directly tied to this unchecked toxic behavior and reckless risk-taking.
Right. And the takeaway there is that, even if someone is bringing in big bucks initially, if they're toxic, they can end up costing the company way, way more down the line.
Yeah, it's a classic case of short-sightedness, focusing on immediate profits at the expense of, building a healthy and sustainable work environment. And it can backfire spectacularly.
And this isn't just a finance world problem, right? Havel gives examples from Hollywood where toxic leaders have basically run projects into the ground financially.
It's really across the board, whether it's through bad decisions driven by arrogance or legal battles that stem from, mistreatment of employees, or just the overall inefficiency that comes with a negative work environment. Toxicity can drain an organization's resources in so many ways.
And then there's the impact on absenteeism. The data from Kaiser Permanente and Circadian shows that this is a huge financial drain.
It makes sense though, right? If you dread going to work every day, you're going to find ways to avoid it, whether it's calling in sick or, just finding excuses to be out of the office.
And that leads to, decreased productivity. It puts more strain on the employees who are actually there, and it just generally drives up costs.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
And then let's not forget about employee turnover. Research from Harvard Business School estimates that replacing a single toxic worker costs over $12,000.
But I think what's even more important is the potential savings of not hiring toxic people in the first place. That should be the real focus.
Absolutely. Proactive prevention. And studies from Cornerstone On Demand show that employees are far more likely to quit if they're working with someone who's toxic. So it really is a retention issue as well.
It's all connected. A toxic work environment drives people away, which then leads to those increased costs of hiring and training new staff, not to mention the loss of institutional knowledge and experience.
Moving beyond the purely financial, there's the huge issue of reputational damage. The Wells Fargo scandal is a perfect example. I mean, we're talking massive fines, lawsuits from customers, even lawsuits from employees who were punished for not engaging in the unethical behavior they were being pressured to do. Their reputation took a nosedive.
It's a really stark reminder that what happens inside an organization, especially when it comes to ethics and how people are treated, can have massive external consequences.
And then the truly tragic situation with the University of Maryland football team, a player's death that was linked to this incredibly toxic culture of, fear, intimidation, and just brutal verbal abuse.
Yeah, that case was just heartbreaking. It led to multiple firings and suspensions, and obviously it really tarnished the university's reputation.
It really underscores how how dangerous this stuff can be when it's allowed to fester. It's not just, hurt feelings. It can have devastating real-world consequences.
Exactly. And Havel points out that this isn't just a problem for, big corporations or high-profile institutions. He even shares an example from a nonprofit where a toxic individual was promoted to a leadership position and it ended up causing chaos.
Yeah. Board members resigned, productivity plummeted, and it really impacted their ability to, fulfill their mission and help the people they were supposed to be serving.
Which is just tragic, right? Because in that kind of environment, the focus shifts from doing good in the world to just managing the internal drama.
And then there's the very real health costs we talked about earlier. I mean, the wave of suicides at France Telecom during that period of, major restructuring and layoffs. It's a pretty stark example of how a toxic work environment can push people to the brink.
It's a really sobering reminder of the profound impact that stress and negativity can have on people's mental health. And there's a ton of research that backs this up. Studies have linked toxic bosses to an increased risk of heart attacks, and workplace bullying is clearly linked to a higher risk of cardiovascular disease.
It's not just about feeling a bit stressed after a long day. We're talking about serious and potentially life-threatening health consequences. So recognizing these patterns and being able to identify these toxic personalities is so crucial. And Havel offers some really helpful categories. Now, these aren't, clinical diagnoses, but rather these recognizable patterns of negative behavior. He talks about, the belittlers, the credit thieves, the gossips, the wet blankets.
And I think what's so helpful about these archetypes is that they give you a way to start recognizing these toxic behaviors in others. And that's the first step to protecting yourself.
He also gets into what he calls the dark triad, which sounds, honestly, pretty terrifying. We're talking Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy or sociopathy.
And these can be really destructive personality types to encounter in a work environment.
Right. So you've got your Machiavellians who are master manipulators. You've got your narcissists who have this, inflated sense of self-importance and zero empathy. And then your sociopaths who are often very charming on the surface, but also incredibly manipulative and lacking in remorse.
Is a pretty unsettling list, but it's so important to be aware of these patterns because, maybe you've got a colleague who's constantly taking credit for your work or who's subtly undermining others to get ahead. Those are classic Machiavellian tactics. Or maybe you've got a boss who demands constant praise and just flies off the handle at any perceived criticism. Those could be signs of narcissistic tendencies.
So what do you actually do if you find yourself stuck in one of these toxic situations? Havel shares some of his own strategies for dealing with Hazel, including this elaborate lunch meeting trap he sets up to expose her behavior. Sounds like something out of a movie.
It is pretty ingenious. And while his specific approach might not work for every situation, the underlying principle is super valuable. Document everything, be strategic, and find ways to either directly address the behavior or at least, protect yourself from the fallout.
But then we see Susie, who seems to be completely enabling Hazel.
Yeah. And it shows how difficult it can be when management isn't just, unhelpful, but they're actually part of the problem.
Right. And it's not always malicious, right? Sometimes it's just easier to avoid conflict, or maybe they're afraid of rocking the boat. But that inaction can actually make things worse for everyone in the long run.
Absolutely. Because it sends the message that this behavior is tolerated, even condoned.
And then there's the whole question of HR's role in toxic organizations. Havel has a pretty, I'd say a controversial take on this. He argues that in a lot of cases, HR is more concerned with protecting the company and upper management than they are with actually helping employees.
Yeah, and that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. Because ideally, HR should be this neutral, supportive resource for everyone. But in a truly toxic environment, they can become complicit in perpetuating that toxicity.
He even lays out some specific signs to watch out for, like, constantly moving the goalposts for employees, finding fault with people who are raising legitimate concerns, promoting incompetent or even toxic people, while good employees mysteriously disappear. He uses the examples of Wynn Resorts and the city of Nashville payroll coordinator to really drive this point home.
And those are just a couple of examples, right? There are so many cases where HR has failed to protect employees and in some instances has even actively contributed to a harmful work environment.
So what can you do to survive in a toxic workplace? Havel offers some really practical advice. He talks about becoming so good at your job that you're basically untouchable.
Yeah, make yourself indispensable.
Increase your visibility within the organization in positive ways so you're not, just flying under the radar. Steer clear of those gossipy groups. Build strong alliances with your colleagues and be really careful about what personal information you share at work because you never know how it might be used against you.
It's almost like, going into survival mode.
Right. And he also emphasizes the importance of documentation. Like, keep a record of everything, those emails, those meeting notes, any instances of bad behavior. Because if you ever need to make a case for yourself, you'll have that paper trail.
Exactly. It's about protecting yourself.
And maybe most importantly, he says you should always have an exit strategy. Network, keep your resume updated, make sure your finances are in order, because you never know when you might need to make a quick escape.
It's about having that sense of agency and control, even in a situation that feels really disempowering.
And he also talks about what he calls fire watching when you're job hunting. So basically, doing your due diligence to avoid those toxic workplaces in the first place.
Which is such good advice. Like, before you buy a house, you get it inspected, right?
Yeah.
You want to know what you're getting into.
Exactly. So check those online reviews on sites like Glassdoor and Indeed. Really pay attention to the vibe you get when you go in for an interview. Is the office environment tense? Are people whispering in corners? Those are red flags. Yeah. Connect with current or former employees through social media, try to get the inside scoop.
And don't be afraid to ask tough questions during your interviews. Like, what's the turnover rate like? What are the biggest challenges facing the team? Really try to get a sense of the company culture beyond the polished facade they're presenting.
Absolutely. All right, so now let's shift gears and talk about what organizations can do to actually prevent and address toxicity. Havel highlights some companies that are known for having really positive cultures, like Southwest Airlines, TD Industries, Ryan LLC, Cumulus Radio.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that they all approach it in slightly different ways. But they share this core commitment to creating a healthy and supportive environment for their employees.
So Southwest, for example, they're really known for their focus on hiring for attitude. It's not just about skills, it's about finding people who are going to be a good fit for the culture. TD Industries has this really strong emphasis on their core values, which they weave into everything they do. Ryan LLC is big on flexibility and work-life balance. And Cumulus Radio, they actually went through this huge cultural transformation, even selling their company plane and using the money to give employees raises.
It's about walking the walk, right?
Yeah.
Not just talking about values, but actually demonstrating them through concrete actions.
And Havel lays out some key steps for building that positive culture. First, you have to clearly define your values. What do you stand for? What kind of behavior do you want to see? Then you need a plan to actually implement those values. You got to communicate them constantly and consistently throughout the organization. And you got to be willing to call out and correct any behavior that doesn't align with those values.
Yeah, you need both the offense, proactively establishing those positive values, and the defense actively addressing any toxicity that crops up.
And it's not a one-time thing, right? It's an ongoing process. You got to constantly reinforce those values. You got to be willing to adapt as the organization evolves, and you got to make sure that leadership is truly embodying those values every single day.
Because if leadership isn't on board, it's just not going to work.
Absolutely. And finally, Havel talks about his own departure from the firm and the lessons he learned from that experience.
Yeah, and it's a pretty powerful ending to the book. You really get a sense of, the emotional toll that this toxic environment took on him.
His final meeting with Cecil, the manipulative email he gets from Susie, it really drives home the point that he wasn't going to find any real support there. And he ultimately decides that he has to leave for his own well-being.
It's a reminder that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from a toxic situation.
He reflects on some of the, I guess you could say, blind spots that he had going into that job, like his, maybe overly optimistic view of how things would be. And he talks about the difference between words and actions, people can say all the right things, but if their behavior doesn't match up, it's meaningless.
And it's interesting. He also talks about how he realized that he was often better at advocating for others than for himself, which I think a lot of people can relate to.
Absolutely. And then he talks about, the awkwardness of explaining why you left a toxic job in future interviews. It's a really tricky situation to navigate.
Yeah, because you don't want to badmouth your previous employer, but you also need to be honest about why you moved on.
But ultimately, he frames it as a learning experience. Like, adversity can make you stronger, and it can teach you some really valuable lessons.
Exactly. It's about turning those challenges into opportunities for growth.
So, to wrap things up, Our deep dive into toxic workplaces, using Havel's book as our guide, along with all that other great research, has really shown us that these environments aren't just unpleasant. They're incredibly costly, both financially and in terms of human suffering.
Yeah, we've seen the impact on everything from productivity and profits to people's physical and mental health, and even in some cases, people's lives.
Recognizing those toxic personalities, understanding the dynamics that create these environments, and knowing what steps you can take to either protect yourself or, even better, avoid them altogether, that's crucial knowledge for anyone navigating the modern workplace.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought. Take a moment to think about your own work environment. Are there any of those unnamed, vague, special challenges lurking beneath the surface?
Any subtle red flags that maybe you've been brushing aside?
And regardless of your role, whether you're an individual contributor or a leader, what can you do to fireproof your own professional future?
We've just scratched the surface here today, and we encourage you to check out Pete Havel's The Arsonist in the Office. There's so much more to unpack in there, and of course there are tons of other great resources out there on workplace culture.
We hope this deep dive has given you, some new insights, maybe some surprising facts, and most importantly, some actionable advice that you can use to create a healthier and more fulfilling work life for yourself.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.